Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Izuku was declared a UA traitor part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 2, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content and leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story, 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗲 from Wattpad. So let's start the video. Izuku Midoriya walked through the crowded hallways of a high school, his mind filled with his plans for the day. He was focused on improving his control over One for All, determined to live up to the legacy that All Might had entrusted him with. However, something felt off. He couldn't shake a sense of unease as he approached his classroom. When he opened the door, he was met not by his classmates but by two familiar figures standing in the middle of the empty room, Aizawa and All Might. Both wore serious expressions, their postures tense. "Midoriya, we need to talk," Aizawa said, his voice devoid of its usual gruffness. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, and they seemed to carry a hint of sadness. Midoriya's heart sank as he realized this wasn't a normal conversation. "Is something wrong, sensei?" he asked, his voice faltering slightly as he stepped into the room. The door clicked shut behind him, and he felt an invisible weight settle over him. All Might took a step forward, his face solemn. "Young Midoriya, I know how much you've given to carry One for All. But after much deliberation, we've made a decision." Midoriya's heart raced, and he could barely find his voice. "A decision about what?" Aizawa's capture weapon flicked out in an instant, wrapping around Midoriya's arms and binding him tightly. Midoriya's eyes widened in shock. "Hey Aizawa-sensei. What are you doing?" Aizawa's gaze remained fixed. "I'm sorry, Midoriya. This is necessary." All Might's face was filled with sorrow as he approached Midoriya, his hand glowing faintly with the power of One for All. "I trusted you with this power, but we have determined that, for the safety of everyone, One for All must be returned." Midoriya's heart shattered as he struggled against Aizawa's hold. "No, All Might, please. I've worked so hard, I've done everything I could." But his pleas were met with silence. All Might placed a hand on Midoriya's shoulder, his expression heavy with regret. "Young Midoriya, you're a true hero in spirit. But sometimes hard choices have to be made." With that, All Might took a hair from Midoriya's hair, transferring One for All, drawing the quirk out from Midoriya's body. Midoriya felt a surge of energy leaving him, a deep emptiness settling within him as the power he had worked so hard to amass slipped away. The process was swift, yet it left him feeling hollow and powerless. As All Might stepped back, Midoriya slumped forward, held up only by Aizawa's binding. "Why?" Midoriya whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Why would you take it away?" All Might's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, young Midoriya. I hope one day you'll understand." Aizawa released him, and Midoriya collapsed to the ground, his body weak and his spirit broken. Aizawa and All Might exchanged a somber glance before they left the room, leaving Midoriya alone with the silence and the weight of their decision. As Midoriya lay on the cold floor of the empty classroom, struggling to process the devastating loss of One for All, he heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching. He looked up, his vision blurred by tears, only to see 𝗍𝗫 standing at the doorway, flanked by police officers. The small principal's expression was unusually serious, devoid of his typical cheerful demeanor. "Midoriya," 𝗍𝗫 began, his voice calm but firm, "I'm afraid this decision extends beyond just removing One for All from you." Midoriya's eyes widened, dread pooling in his stomach. What do you mean?" 𝗍𝗫 took a step forward, his small figure casting a large shadow in the doorway. "Given recent events and for the safety of the public, we have determined that it is necessary for you to be placed in custody." The police officers behind 𝗍𝗫 stepped forward, and Midoriya could feel their intent, a chill running down his spine. He instinctively tried to back away, even though he felt powerless without One for All. "Please, Principal 𝗍𝗫, I don't understand," Midoriya stammered, his voice filled with desperation. "What did I do wrong? Why are you doing this to me?" 𝗍𝗫's face softened, but only for a brief moment. "Midoriya, this is not easy for any of us. However, we believe this is the best course of action to ensure the safety of everyone, including yourself. Tartarus has the resources to monitor and help you. The words hit Midoriya like a punch to the gut. The reality of what was happening sank in as the officers approached him, placing 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗵𝗃 around his wrists. The cold metal against his skin felt surreal, each click echoing in his mind. "No, no, please," he cried, struggling weakly against their hold. "I don't understand. I just wanted to be a hero. I only wanted to help people." The officers ignored his pleas, lifting him to his feet. Izawa and All Might stood in the background, their faces a mix of regret and sorrow, but neither of them spoke. Midoriya's heart broke as he looked at his former mentor, who now wouldn't even meet his gaze. The walk out of the school was quiet and filled with a heavy atmosphere. Midoriya could feel the stares of other students peering from the windows, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. The whispers began as they watched their classmate, the once hopeful hero, being escorted by the police. As they reached the school's gates, a prison transport vehicle waited, its dark metal surface cold and unwelcoming. The officers guided Midoriya inside, locking him in the heavily secured cell meant to transport criminals to Tartarus prison. Sitting alone in the back of the vehicle, Midoriya's mind raced with a torrent of emotions: confusion, fear, betrayal, and heartbreak. He had lost everything in the span of a few short moments. One for all, his dreams of being a hero, and the trust of those he had looked up to. As the vehicle began to move, Midoriya could only sit in silence, staring at the metal walls around him. He felt hollow, as though a part of him had been ripped away, leaving nothing but an emptiness that he wasn't sure he could ever fill. The gates of Tartarus loomed ahead, a dark fortress that now stood as his prison. His journey as a hero had come to an end, replaced by a nightmare he could never have imagined. As then after weeks we see Midoriya being taken to court as he was malnourished, as he was barely able to walk. The courtroom was tense, packed with reporters, heroes, and onlookers who had once celebrated Izuku Midoriya as the symbol of the next generation. Now, however, they stared at him in chains, eyes filled with contempt. The boy who once bore the weight of the world's hope now looked broken, a ghost of his former self. His green eyes, once so full of determination, were hollow, and his hands were shackled, ensuring no sudden movements. His mother, Inko Midoriya, sat in the front row, clutching a crumpled handkerchief, tears streaming down her face. She looked small, defeated, her entire body trembling as she watched her son, the boy she had raised to be a hero, face the wrath of an unrelenting system. The prosecutor, a stern man with sharp eyes and a cruel twist to his lips, paced in front of the jury. In his hands he held Izuku's journal, waving it in the air as though it were a weapon. "This," he sneered, "is not just a journal. This is a detailed analysis of every hero and quirk at you. Hi, complete with weaknesses, strategies, and detailed combat notes. This is not the work of a hero in training. This is the work of a traitor." A murmur of shock rippled through the room, and Izuku winced, feeling the weight of every accusing gaze. He tried to raise his voice, but it came out as a whisper. I did it to understand, to be prepared," the prosecutor scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. "Prepared? For what, Midoriya? To betray us? To hand over valuable information to villains?" He shook his head, letting the silence hang heavily. No true hero would need to know how to bring down their friends. Izuku's fists clenched, a surge of anger bubbling beneath his despair. "It was never meant for that. I wanted to protect them." But no one listened. The crowd seemed deaf to his words, and his former classmates watched in cold silence. One by one, they took the stand, each delivering their testimony like a final nail in his coffin. Bakugo, his former friend and rival, shook his head, a rare sadness in his eyes. "Deku, I don't know who you are anymore," he said, his voice rough, but lacking its usual fire. "You had all of us fooled." Todoroki followed, his gaze icy as ever. "We trusted you, Midoriya," he said flatly. "You betrayed that trust. There's nothing else to say." And then Uraraka, tears pooling in her eyes. Her voice cracked as she spoke, the hurt in her voice a sharp contrast to the cold testimonies before. I thought I knew you, Deku, but when I saw that journal, she shook her head, swallowing back her emotions. It was like you were a stranger. Izuku's heart twisted painfully, each friend's words a dagger that cut deeper than any physical wound could. He glanced at his mother, who was barely holding herself together. She looked at him with a pained expression, mouthing, "I believe you," but her support was little comfort against the tidal wave of condemnation. Finally, the judge called for silence as the president of the 𝗧𝗪𝗼 Public Safety Commission took the stage. Her expression was unreadable as she held a document in her hands, the official paperwork that would establish Izuku of his hero status. "Izuku Midoriya," she announced, her voice as cold and unyielding as steel, "in light of the evidence, and under the authority granted to me by the 𝗧𝗪𝗼 Public Safety Commission, I hereby revoke your status as a hero. From this day forward, you are no longer recognized as part of the hero system." The courtroom fell into a stunned silence, the finality of her words hanging in the air. Izuku's face was expressionless, yet his mind reeled. City of one for all, abandoned by his friends, and now declared a villain. It was as if every part of him was being erased. The president's gaze hardened as she continued, "Furthermore, you are sentenced to life in Tartarus prison for the security of our society." At that, Inko stood up, her voice breaking as she cried out, "No. Please. My son isn't a villain. He was only trying to help, to understand." She pushed forward, trying to reach him, but the guards held her back as she fought against them. "Please, you don't understand, he's a hero." But her cries fell on deaf ears. Izuku was already being led away, his head hung low. The courtroom's voices grew distant as his mother's sobs echoed, the final sound of his old life slipping away. As he walked down the hallway, shackled and powerless, a dark realization dawned upon him. They had taken everything from him. His power, his dreams, even his own mother's love was powerless to save him now. He was a shell, a hollowed-out version of the boy who had once believed in justice and heroes. And in that void, a spark of something darker ignited. If they wanted to see him as a villain, if they wanted to cage him as a monster, he would show them just how wrong they were. They would regret the day they cast him aside. Izuku was yanked out of the courtroom in HNDCFFS, flanked by officers on either side. His head was lowered, but his eyes burned with anger, seething beneath a surface of quiet resentment. Outside, a sea of reporters awaited, cameras flashing and microphones moved forward, capturing every humiliating moment as he was paraded past them. Behind him, teachers and staff watched with cold, stoic faces, their backs turned on the boy they'd once praised. The reporters swarmed, shouting questions and commentary. One of them sneered, "You students are true heroes for exposing this traitor." Another praised, "Thanks to Bakugo and the others, we can all feel a little safer tonight." Izuku's fists clenched, his nails digging into his palms. His heart pounded with a furious rhythm, his body trembling with barely contained rage. They were thanking his classmates, praising them for turning on him, for labeling him a villain without ever listening to his side. His mother, Inko, was being held back by security as she tried to reach him, her desperate voice drowned out by the crowd. Some of the reporters turned on her, muttering harsh comments, their words like knives slicing through her. "Guess being a villain runs in the family," one jeered. "What kind of mother raises a traitor? She must be ashamed of him," another added, smirking as Inko's face crumpled with pain. Izuku could feel his blood boiling, his vision narrowing as the anger roared in his ears. Suddenly, in a surge of adrenaline, he twisted against the officers holding him, pulling free. Before anyone could react, he charged toward Bakugo, his former friend and rival, the one who had stood in court and condemned him without hesitation. Izuku's head connected with Bakugo's face in a brutal headbutt, the impact echoing through the chaotic crowd. Bakugo stumbled back, cursing. Just as Izuku's knee came up, his fury channeled into one brutal strike that snapped Bakugo's arm with a sickening crack. "That's for betraying me, you 𝗵𝗲." Izuku snarled, his voice filled with venom. The officers were on him in seconds, restraining him with more force, pulling him back. But he wasn't finished. His gaze locked onto Uraraka, who had watched it all unfold with wide eyes, her face pale. "You abandoned me for that Pomeranian bee," he spat, his voice laced with bitterness and contempt. "You're nothing but a worthless fraud, a fake hero, no better than the rest of them." Uraraka's face crumpled with shock, hurt flashing in her eyes. But Izuku didn't care anymore. The bitterness and anger had swallowed him whole, turning his once kind heart into a hardened core of resentment. As he was dragged back toward the police van, he could still hear the crowd around him, jeering, condemning, whispering horrible things about him and his mother. The hatred, the betrayal, all of it coiled tighter inside him, feeding the dark flame that had been ignited within him. He glanced back one last time, meeting his mother's tearful gaze, and a bitter resolve settled into his heart. They had destroyed him, everything he'd believed in, everything he'd fought for. And now they would all pay. Inko's heart shattered as she watched her son dragged away, his face still twisted in anger and betrayal. She broke free from the security holding her back and ran after him, her voice trembling as she called out desperately, "Izuku! Izuku, please!" Izuku, handcuffed and held tightly by the officers, turned his head just enough to catch a glimpse of his mother pushing through the crowd. Her face was a mixture of terror, heartbreak, and helplessness, a look he'd never seen before, and one he wished he could erase. He clenched his jaw, a pang of guilt slipping through the cracks in his rage. "Inko Midoriya, please stay back," one of the officers shouted, trying to stop her, but she refused to listen. She stumbled forward, her breaths ragged, as her trembling hand reached out toward the police van where her son was being shoved inside. "Please, don't take him," she cried, her voice breaking. "Izuku's not a villain. He's my son, my precious boy, please, just give him a chance to explain." The crowd watched, some with pity, others with judgment in their eyes. Whispers floated through the air, their venomous words piercing her like knives. Poor woman. She raised a monster. She should have known better. He was always too close to those villains, wasn't he? Inko's knees nearly gave way as she heard the hateful comments, but she forced herself to stay upright, her love for her son giving her strength. She reached the police van just as the door was about to close and caught one last glimpse of Izuku's face through the bars. His eyes softened, just for a moment, a flicker of sorrow and regret in his gaze. "Izuku," she called out, her hand pressing against the cold metal of the van's door. "I'll fight for you. I won't let them take you away like this." Izuku's eyes locked onto hers, the anger melting away for a brief second, replaced by something vulnerable, something that reminded her of the little boy who used to cling to her leg, wide-eyed and hopeful. But then, the door slammed shut, cutting off her view, and the van roared to life, pulling away. Inko collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she watched her son disappear down the road, taken from her by a world that had turned against him. Her sobs filled the air, raw and heart-wrenching, a mother's love laid bare for everyone to see. "Izuku, I'm so sorry," she whispered, clutching her chest as though she could hold together the pieces of her broken heart. "I won't give up on you. I'll find a way to get you back, no matter what." But as the crowd dispersed, with whispers and harsh glances cast her way, Inko realized that her battle was only beginning. The world had branded her son a villain, and now, it seemed, she would have to stand alone against everyone to prove his innocence, even if no one believed in him but her. Inko Midoriya's heart throbbed with grief and fury as she marched towards the U. Faculty members gathered outside the courtroom. Her normally gentle face was contorted with rage, her eyes burning with an intensity that caught everyone's attention. Nizu, Aizawa, and All Might stood before her, trying to appear resolute, but they couldn't mask the unease they felt under her seething glare. She stopped in front of All Might first, her hands trembling with emotion. Without warning, her hand shot up, and she slapped him hard across the face, the sound echoing around them. The shock was evident in All Might's eyes, but he didn't retaliate. He stood there, speechless, as Inko's voice rose, full of hurt and anger. "How could you?" she hissed, her voice breaking. "You, the man my son idolized his whole life, the man who promised to protect him. And this is how you repay him? By letting him be taken away like a criminal." All Might's face fell, guilt overtaking him as he tried to form words, but Inko didn't give him a chance. She turned to Aizawa, her fury unwavering. And you, Eraserhead. You knew Izuku, you saw him fight for his classmates, for you, for this school. Did none of that mean anything to you? Her voice dripped with contempt. You all called him a hero until it was easier to cast him aside. Aizawa looked down, unable to meet her piercing gaze, shame evident in his silence. Just then, 𝗵𝘃𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗲 approached, worry etched on her face. She reached out as if to comfort Inko, but Inko recoiled, her expression darkening further. Don't you dare. Inko spat, her voice laced with venom. Don't even consider me your friend anymore, Mitsuki. Because of your brat, my son is in jail. Katsuki's recklessness, his hatred, all of it led to this. Her hands clenched, her quirk, which she usually kept under control, began to flicker, a manifestation of her overwhelming emotions. Before anyone could react, she extended her hand toward Katsuki, who was standing nearby, watching the scene with a mix of annoyance and confusion. In a sudden surge of her quirk, she targeted the nerves in Katsuki's arm, tugging sharply. Katsuki gasped, his face contorting in pain as his arm jerked involuntarily. He gritted his teeth, clutching his wrist as his nerves burned under her influence. Inko, stop. Mitsuki cried, horrified as her son stumbled backward, wincing in agony. The police moved quickly, restraining Inko before her quirk could escalate further, but her fury remained. Despite the officers holding her back, she managed to cast one last, withering glare at Mitsuki. This is my return gift, Mitsuki. The pain my son feels. Consider this just a fraction of what I feel now. Mitsuki, shaken and heartbroken, pleaded with the police, please drop the charges. She's a mother in pain. I can't blame her for lashing out. The officers exchanged glances, reluctantly easing their grip on Inko but informing her that she would be put under house arrest due to the incident. Inko didn't resist. She simply slumped, her rage fading into a sorrow so deep it threatened to consume her. Back at home, Inko sat alone, confined but lost in her anguish. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she clutched a photograph of her son, the boy who had once been her joy, her pride. She whispered to the empty room, her voice barely a breath. Izuku, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you. The house was silent, save for her quiet sobs, echoing her endless worry and heartbreak for her son, who now faced an uncertain future. After 1 week, Inko sat alone in her dimly lit living room, a glass of sake trembling in her hand as fresh tears streamed down her face. The grief had settled into a heavy weight in her chest, so unbearable that she could hardly breathe. She picked up her phone with shaky fingers, scrolling through her contacts until she found his name, her husband. The one she had once leaned on for strength, now a distant voice she could only hope would answer her desperate call. The dial tone rang once, twice, but no answer. The line clicked over to the message recorder, and Inko's heart sank, but she refused to let this be the end. She took a shaky breath, her voice breaking as she spoke into the silence. Hisashi, it's me, Inko. She swallowed, barely able to keep her voice steady. Please, please, I need you. Izuku needs you. She paused, fighting through a fresh wave of sobs. They've taken him, Hisashi. They've taken our son. You? The court, everyone. They branded him as a villain, as a traitor. They're locking him away for life, and I can't do this alone. He's just a boy. A boy. They took one for all from him of everything. Her voice grew weaker, barely above a whisper. They've labeled him something he's not, and I wasn't strong enough to stop them. I need you here. I need you to help save him, Hisashi. Please, if you ever loved us, if you still care, come back. Come back and help our son. Her words trailed off, her voice lost to quiet, choked sobs as she pressed the phone to her forehead, as though hoping that somehow he could feel her pain across the distance. I don't know what to do without you, without him, she whispered, clutching the phone to her chest, as if the mere action could bridge the gap between them. The line clicked off, the message sent, and Inko sat there in the silence, drowning in her sorrow. Her heart felt hollow, an aching void that nothing could fill. She took another shaky sip of sake, the bitterness only amplifying the emptiness within her. She stared blankly at the wall, wondering if her plea would reach him or if she would be left to face this nightmare alone. As we see some pictures kept as she saw herself with her husband in not wondering if he will answer or not. As we see some pictures kept as she saw herself with her husband in not wondering if he will answer or not. Inko sat alone at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she took another sip from the half-empty bottle in front of her. Inko sat alone at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she took another sip from the half-empty bottle in front of her. The bitter taste did little to numb the ache in her heart, a hollow pain that felt like it might tear her apart. She could hardly believe how quickly everything had unraveled. The husband who had once been her steady rock, the boy who had been her world. Both gone, one by one. First, her husband had been called to America for work, and now her precious Izuku, taken from her by people she had once trusted, people she thought were family. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced down at the screen, finding yet another notification. Her inbox was flooded with messages, nasty, hateful words hurled at her and Izuku from strangers who knew nothing of the boy he truly was. "Your son's a monster," read one. "You raised a traitor," spat another. "Guess the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Just another worthless family of villains." The words cut her like a knife, each one tearing open the wound in her chest a little wider. She couldn't bear it anymore, couldn't hold back the tears that spilled down her face as she scrolled through the hate filling her inbox. Trembling, she reached for her phone and dialed a familiar number. She needed to hear his voice, needed to believe there was someone else in this world who cared about their son. But the call only rang until a voicemail clicked on. She took a shuddering breath, choking back a sob as she left a message. "Plus, please come back," she begged into the phone, her voice barely above a whisper. "Our son, they took him and I don't know what to do. He's all alone, and I can't protect him. Please come home. Help me save him. I can't lose him too." She hung up, her heart shattering into pieces. As she gripped the bottle tighter, tears continued to stream down her face, each one a reflection of the bitterness and grief that had taken root in her soul. Izuku stumbled as he was dragged forward, shackled at the wrists and ankles, the weight of his chains heavy against his bruised skin. The guards flanked him on either side, their faces grim and devoid of any compassion. He kept his gaze fixed forward, refusing to meet their eyes as they led him through the imposing gates of Tartarus. The sheer scale of the prison loomed over him, its walls high and unyielding, shrouded in cold, unwelcoming steel. He felt the sting of a needle as a technician took his BLD, his DNA catalogued as they prepared to extirpate him of any identity beyond his inmate number. The retinal scanner blinked in front of him, the light bright and harsh as he was forced to look into it. The last remnants of his old life were torn from him, his records, his very essence now bound to this place of darkness. The guards wasted no time. Rough hands pushed him forward, and Izuku staggered, barely catching himself before being shoved into his cell. The metal door clanged shut behind him with a deafening finality, the echo reverberating through the cold walls as if the prison itself was swallowing him whole. Izuku looked around the dim, narrow cell, a stark concrete box with barely any light, save for the faint glow filtering through the small, barred window high above. He could hear the faint hum of the facility's machinery, the distant sounds of footsteps and voices, all fading into an oppressive silence that weighed on him like a lead blanket. He clenched his fists, the reality settling in. They had cast him away, discarded him like he was nothing. Anger bubbled beneath his calm exterior as he lowered himself to the cold floor, his mind racing with thoughts of revenge, plans forming and unraveling in the back of his mind. They thought they could lock him away, cage him in this pit, and silence him. But he would prove them wrong. This was just the beginning. Izuku glanced around the dim cell, noting the two figures already present, the infamous villains he'd heard whispers of back in society. Both men eyed him with a mixture of contempt and amusement, their twisted grins wide with the satisfaction of seeing a former hero in turn brought low. Well, look at what we have here. Little Deku, the wannabe hero, sneered one of the villains, a towering figure with scars across his arms, evidence of past battles. His companion, a wiry man with a cruel smile, laughed, leaning against the wall as he looked Izuku up and down like prey. "You thought you could save people," Didn't you, hero? He jeered, mocking the very title that once defined Izuku. Now look at you. Just another rat trapped in a cage. Izuku tensed, his fists clenching as the taunts dug into his skin. But before he could react, the larger villain lunged, landing a punch squarely in his stomach. The impact sent him stumbling back, the force nearly knocking the wind out of him. He bit down, refusing to make a sound. Showing pain here, showing weakness, that would only fuel them more. The wiry villain closed in next, grabbing a handful of Izuku's hair and yanking him up to meet his gaze. Look at you, all high and mighty in your hero dreams, he hissed, slamming Izuku's head against the wall, each impact resonating with a painful thud. Where are your classmates now? Your friends? Bet they're all laughing at you for getting yourself thrown in here. Izuku's vision blurred, but he steadied himself, his mind stubbornly pushing back against the pain. Each punch, each kick, felt like a new strike against not just his body but his pride. This was his reality now, a hell where his past identity was used against him, where the villains thrived on his suffering. The assault continued, the two villains taking turns, savoring each blow, each twisted word aimed to break him down. But as he slumped to the floor, bruised and bleeding, Izuku's resolve only grew sharper, like iron forged in fire. Every strike, every mocking word, was fuel to the hatred building inside him. This wasn't just a beating, it was the spark of a new purpose, one that burned deeper and darker than anything he'd known before. The torture, he realized, was just beginning. Next few weeks, day after day, Tartarus became a relentless cycle of torment for Izuku. No corner of the prison offered safety, no break existed from the endless onslaught. In the cafeteria, villains would swipe his food, laughing cruelly as they dumped trays over his head, staining his face with cold, uneaten meals. Hunger gnawed at him, but each attempt to eat led to more ridicule, more pain. The washroom was a new level of humiliation. The moment he entered, waiting predators would corner him, forcing him onto the grimy floor. Go on, Deku, give it a nice clean, they'd sneer, shoving his face towards the toilets, forcing him to scrape his knuckles against the filthy tiles. His pride was trampled, yet he endured, his silent resolve like a quiet, unbreakable wall within. The courtyard offered no reprieve. Here, in broad daylight, where guards turned a blind eye, his tormentors treated him like a human punching bag. Izuku felt the bruises multiply, his muscles aching. With every fresh kick, every knuckle that struck bone, villains would circle him, taking turns, laughing as his knees buckled and he fell to the ground, struggling to stand upright each time. He lost count of the bruises, the cuts, the broken skin. After one particularly brutal day, his limp body was dragged to the prison infirmary, barely conscious and covered in fresh injuries. Lying on the cot, every inch of him ached, every breath felt like swallowing glass. But beneath the agony, a seething hatred simmered. His body was battered, but his spirit was far from broken. Each bruise, each broken rib, felt like fuel to a silent, burning vow that echoed in his mind, one word resounding in his thoughts: revenge. In Tartarus, pain became Izuku's constant companion, yet paradoxically, so did survival. Each day, the villains would break his bones, split his skin, cut and batter him until he lay barely conscious. And each night, the prison doctor would arrive with cold precision, mending his shattered form with relentless efficiency. Izuku's body was forced to recover, his bones fusing stronger, his endurance growing beneath layers of bruises and scarring. The guards were no less brutal. They had their own twisted games, denying him rest, startling him awake every time he managed to slip into brief, exhausted sleep. Shackles would dig into his wrists and ankles, ensuring he was never comfortable. Each new healing seal only hardened his muscles, calloused his skin, and strengthened the very bones they sought to break. Over weeks, Izuku's body became a weapon forged in agony. His pain tolerance was pushed far beyond the human threshold, his bones as resilient as iron, and his will sharpened like a blade. Every bruise was a badge, every scar a reminder that he was still standing. The torture was meant to break him, but instead, it was creating something altogether unbreakable. With every passing day, he grew more immune to their cruelty, and an unquenchable rage simmered within him, waiting for the day he'd finally be free to repay every one of them for the hell they had inflicted upon him. Inside 𝗧𝗵𝗃 sat in his dimly lit cell, his usual calm replaced with a simmering fury as he replayed the voice message from his wife. The audio trembled with her desperate pleas, her words raw and broken, filled with a pain he'd never wanted her to know. She had begged him to bring their son back, her voice barely holding together as she poured out her anguish. Every word was like fuel to a smoldering fire within him. He had promised her once, on the day they parted, that he would never bring his darkness into their lives again, that he'd stay in the shadows, for her sake and for the sake of their son. But this was different. The very world she had entrusted with their son's safety had betrayed them, branding Izuku a traitor and throwing him into Tartarus. His own flesh and blood, now buried in the darkest depths of society's prison. His hands clenched as his quirk surged, capturing the waves of information that flowed in and out of Tartarus, a power he had kept secret. Suddenly he detected a small flurry of signals surrounding a new arrival, a frequency spike signifying heightened activity. A prisoner transport had just arrived. He didn't need further confirmation. He knew. They had taken Izuku there. They had taken his son. In that moment, the weight of his promise began to shift under the tidal wave of his rage. His voice was barely a whisper as he spoke, but every word held the weight of his resolve. They've crossed a line. And there will be no going back. 𝗧𝗵𝗃's eyes narrowed as he peered through the grainy camera feeds he had managed to hack into, carefully threading his quirk to navigate the prison's surveillance systems. Every day he watched his son suffer, tossed around, mocked, tortured by villains and guards alike. Izuku's small moments of defiance were crushed almost instantly by the brutal environment of Tartarus. Food was thrown at him rather than given, his bones were broken and left to heal only to be broken again, and every breath he took was met with some new cruelty. Yet 𝗧𝗵𝗃 felt powerless. The dampening cuffs around his wrists and ankles suppressed his abilities, restraining him like iron chains and keeping him from acting. The injuries he carried also held him back, as his own strength had been weakened by his long confinement. His every attempt to reach out was met with unyielding resistance. The rage, the helplessness, was a bitter pill to swallow for a man who had once controlled empires. Every time he watched his son suffer, it was as if the walls around him closed in further, intensifying his rage. But he forced himself to breathe, to remain still, even as fury churned in his chest, twisting his resolve into something darker. "Izuku," he whispered under his breath, his voice a mixture of anger and sorrow. "I won't let this stand." Inko Midoriya's heart pounded with every step she took toward the brightly lit UA hall. Through tear-blurred eyes, she could see the silhouettes of heroes and faculty, laughing and chatting, oblivious to the weight of her presence. Her fists clenched as she thought about the recent rejection she'd faced when begging the government for a new hearing for Izuku's case. MDM president had dismissed her plea without hesitation, deeming the case closed. Her phone had then buzzed with another cruel irony, news of UA throwing a celebration over their so-called success. They were rejoicing while her son rotted in Tartarus. As Inko entered the hall, the warmth and cheer seemed to drain as her gaze settled on All Might. The former symbol of peace was laughing, unaware of her approach. But a chill fell over him as he noticed her presence, his smile fading into a look of dread. The unmistakable form of Nana Shimura's shadow appeared behind Inko, a testament to the silent support she felt from her son's fallen mentor. Consider Inko angry and Nana behind as she shows same fury without hesitation. She approached All Might, her steps steady, her face hardened by grief and anger. And then, in one swift motion, her hand flew, striking him across the face with a force that silenced the entire room. The music stopped. The murmurs ceased. All eyes were on them, shock etched into every face present. "You all have the audacity to throw a party," she spat, her voice trembling, "while my son is suffering, tortured every day in that hellhole of a prison you helped put him in. You All Might, you who once promised to protect him." All Might lowered his gaze, guilt radiating from him as her words hit him like a hammer. Inko's mind drifted to the agonizing memory of her last visit to Tartarus, where she had seen her son's frail, battered form in the sterile, cold cell. He had smiled faintly, trying to hide his pain, and had told her not to cry. He'd asked her to stop visiting, not wanting her to witness his torment, and pleaded with her to leave Japan for her own safety. Even in his agony, he'd been thinking of her, sacrificing his comfort just so she could walk free of judgment. As she relived the memory, her voice softened but carried the same intensity. You all turned your backs on him. My boy, my Izuku. And now you celebrate. Her voice cracked. Is this what heroes have become? Tears fell freely down her cheeks, but she didn't care. She met each hero's gaze, her expression full of heartbreak and rage, before turning away, leaving the silent hall and broken stairs behind her. As after 2 days, as Inko sat alone in her dimly lit room, broken and bruised, tears streaming down her face, she gathered a small assortment of items that held memories of her son, Izuku. Her hands trembled as she arranged a pine green sweater that her husband had given her, along with a few of Izuku's childhood toys. Beside her lay an open bottle of wine, untouched but offering a strange comfort in its presence. Taking a deep breath, she held her phone up, her face illuminated by the screen as she pressed record. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked, her words tangled in raw emotion. Hello, she began, struggling to find her composure. My name is Izuku Midoriya, or as some of you know me now, the mother of a traitor. Pausing to wipe a tear from her cheek, she continued, her voice strengthening with each revelation. Today, I'm here to tell my story. Because before I am a mother, before I am anything, I am Inko 𝗧𝗵𝗲. Yes, 𝗧𝗵𝗲. My real name, my BRH name, is Inko 𝗧𝗵𝗲. I am the daughter of Nana 𝗧𝗵𝗲, the former symbol of peace. I am the sister of Kotaro 𝗧𝗵𝗲. And we were just children when our mother left us to pursue her mission as a hero. Her words spilled out in a torrent, years of buried anger and sorrow erupting to the surface. My mother left us for this so-called society, she said, her tone laced with bitterness. She abandoned us, Kotaro and me, to an orphanage. She left us to fend for ourselves. My brother, he grew to hate her, to hate everything she stood for. And as much as I tried to understand her decision, a part of me resented her, too. How could she leave us, her children, for a society that forgets heroes so quickly? Inko took a shaky sip from the wine bottle, her eyes glossy and distant as she delved into the memories she had tried so hard to forget. And then my husband. Her voice softened as she remembered him. I met a man after I studied law. He was kind, intelligent, a little mysterious, but he had a warmth that drew me in. We fell in love, and after 3 years of dating, we got married. This pine sweater, was a gift from him. Her fingers traced the fabric, clutching it close to her as she continued, her voice tinged with a painful fondness. When I told him I was 𝗵𝗲𝗄𝗏 with Izuku, he was ecstatic. He was by my side every step of the way, always caring, always gentle. And when our son was born, I saw a joy in him that I thought would last forever. The next part was harder to say, and Inko hesitated, a fresh wave of pain contorting her face. But one day he told me the truth. He was not just any man, he was all for one, the most feared villain in Japan. He had hidden it from me for as long as he could, afraid of what it would mean for us, for Izuku. He told me he had to pretend he was in America because All Might had damaged him so badly he could no longer show his face. He even admitted that he blocked Izuku's quirk, knowing that our son wouldn't be able to handle the full power of his lineage until he was ready for the burden that he would one day inherit. Inko's voice broke as she spoke the last words, her love for both her son and husband mixed with regret and sorrow. This society tore my family apart. My mother died on the battlefield, my husband was branded a monster, and now my son has been left to suffer, to rot in Tartarus for crimes he didn't commit. She placed the phone down, leaning forward as she broke into quiet sobs, her message echoing in the silent room. Inko's voice cracked, her sorrow and resentment boiling over as she faced the camera, a bitter fury in her eyes. You heroes, every single one of you. I hate you all so much. Her fists clenched, white-knuckled with rage. My husband Hisashi, he tried to protect Izuku from this path. He wanted him to live free from the cage of heroism. But Izuku, he was determined, a true hero at heart. And look where it led him. This rotten society took my family, destroyed everything I loved. A tear slid down her cheek as she trembled, her voice softening, almost whispering. I can't handle it anymore. This pain, this emptiness, it's too much. Izuku, I know you would hate me for this, my sweet boy. But I can't bear to see you suffer. You deserve better, and she choked, struggling to keep going, but determination burned behind her eyes. Her final words were almost a plea, laced with a dark resolve. Destroy them, Izuku, destroy this society that thinks it can toy with lives and discard people when they're no longer useful. Tear down this world that judges and destroys without a second thought. Avenge what they've done to us, to our family. With a final breath, she turned off the recording, leaving it to upload automatically. The phone fell from her hand as she took a length of cord in trembling hands, tied it firmly, and with her last ounce of strength, let herself slip away. The video went viral within minutes, spreading like wildfire across the internet. The title blazed across screens nationwide. The last words of Inko Shimura, mother of the UA traitor. Thousands of people watched, the confessions sparking chaos and debates. Shock, confusion, horror, each viewer grappled with the revelation of Izuku's bloodline, of Hisashi's identity, and the raw pain of Inko's final plea. Hours later, Mitsuki Bakugo, frantic after seeing the video herself, burst into Inko's apartment alongside police. Her voice broke as she called out, "Inko! Inko, where are you?" But the words froze in her throat as she entered the room, only to find her dearest friend's lifeless body, hanging, swaying slightly in the quiet stillness. Tears streamed down Mitsuki's face as she stumbled forward, grasping Inko's cold hand, sobbing as she whispered, "Wake up, Inko, please, wake up." But her pleas fell into the silence, as the woman who had once been her closest friend was gone, leaving only pain and the haunting memory of her last words. Meanwhile, in Tartarus, Izuku sat chained to the chair, his head bowed, his body bruised and beaten from the relentless torment he endured daily in Tartarus. His wrists and ankles throbbed where the shackles dug into his skin. He tried to numb himself, to block out the world, to ignore the taunts and sneers of the guards around him, who took sick pleasure in breaking the spirit of the once aspiring hero. One guard sneered as he entered the room, holding up a small screen. "Guess what we have here, Midoriya?" he taunted. "A little farewell message from Mommy dearest." Izuku's head snapped up, his green eyes wide with both fear and confusion. The guard shoved the screen in front of his face, pressing play. The video started, and there was his mother, tired, broken, tears escaping her cheeks as she stared into the camera, her voice filled with grief and anger as she spoke of the betrayal and agony inflicted upon their family. "Izuku, my sweet boy," her words trembled, and Izuku's heart shattered as he watched her pain and sorrow spill out. Each word felt like a knife, slicing through him as she confessed her despair, her hatred for society, and the twisted reality that had brought their family to ruin. He could barely breathe as she continued, her voice tinged with a dark resolve he'd never seen in her before. "You deserve better, and her voice broke, her expression filled with a chilling sadness. "Destroy them, Izuku, destroy this society that thinks it can toy with lives and discard people when they're no longer useful. Avenge what they've done to us." "No, Mom, don't," Izuku's voice cracked, his eyes filling with tears as he shook his head, desperately wanting to reach through the screen and pull her back from this brink. The guard smirked, his tone mocking. "She didn't just record it, kid. It's been broadcasted all over Japan. Looks like your mom really wanted to give the world something to talk about." Izuku was shaking, disbelief mingling with a growing dread. "No, please, this can't." And then the guard's mocking voice delivered the final blow. "Oh, and in case you were wondering, your mother's well, she's gone, Midoriya. Took her own life right after recording this little message. Seems even she couldn't bear to be associated with the traitor she raised." Izuku's world crumbled. His heart felt like it had been ripped from his chest as his mother's last words, her final plea for revenge, echoed in his mind. His body felt numb, but within him, something was shifting, a darkness taking root where hope once resided. "Your fault, kid," the guard continued, his words dripping with malice. "Everyone's calling her the traitor's mother now. Imagine how ashamed she must have been." Izuku's fists clenched, his knuckles turning white, his nails digging into his palms as the rage within him grew. His sorrow and despair twisted, morphing into a relentless fury. All his dreams, all his ideals, had been shattered, and now he had nothing left to lose. For the first time, he felt the embers of vengeance stir in his heart. Meanwhile, All Might watched the video in stunned silence, his face pale as he processed what he'd just seen and heard. Inko Midoriya's confession and her connection to his former foe was already a devastating revelation, but it was the final words that shook him to his core. "Nana had a daughter," he whispered, disbelief flooding his expression as his mind raced. All this time, he'd thought he'd known his mentor's legacy, believed he'd carried on her will without a trace of family to speak of. And now, he realized there was a whole hidden story, a child his mentor had left behind, a son she'd never even known about. Not only that, but Inko's husband had been all for one. The realization struck him like a hammer, the sheer weight of it almost too much to bear. All for one in Nana's daughter, he muttered, his thoughts spiraling. The enemy he'd spent years fighting, the embodiment of his greatest battles, had somehow entwined himself with his mentor's family, leaving a child who had once idolized heroes, who had fought to become one himself, now condemned and twisted by the system All Might once believed in. Horror crept over him as he watched Izuku's reaction on screen, the pain, the betrayal, and, finally, the flicker of something dark, something cold taking root in the young boy's eyes. This was no longer the same bright-eyed, hopeful student he'd met at U. This was a boy with nothing left, broken and hollowed by his own world. "What have we done?" All Might's voice trembled, the weight of his own responsibility crashing down on him. He'd believed in Izuku, chosen him as a successor, and now that very trust, his decision to remain silent and distant, felt like a mistake he couldn't undo. He saw the sorrowful, defeated image of the boy he'd once promised to protect, a boy who, against all odds, had always believed in him, only to be discarded. The screen went blank, and the silence that followed felt deafening. All Might's hands shook slightly as he clenched them, filled with an indescribable grief and guilt. He could almost feel Nana's spirit beside him, a questioning, heart-wrenching presence. He'd failed her legacy, and worst of all, failed the boy who'd tried so desperately to follow in his footsteps. "We created this," he murmured, his gaze falling to the floor as he wondered if there was any path left to right these wrongs, if Izuku would even want redemption. Or had the cruelty he'd endured already sealed his heart in darkness? The quiet evening in Tashinori's apartment was disrupted by a sudden knock on the door. He paused, feeling an unexpected pang of unease. Something about the knock carried a strange intensity, almost like a warning. He pushed aside his apprehension and went to open it. Before Tashinori could even process who it was, a blur shot past him, landing a fierce punch across his jaw. Staggering back, he tried to focus, but the strikes kept coming. He caught a glimpse of the assailant and felt a pit of dread form in his stomach, Gran Torino. His former mentor's face was twisted with rage as he continued delivering blows. Flashback: it was a quiet night in Gran Torino's modest, dimly lit home when he first noticed the notification of a viral video. He didn't often check the news, but something in the title caught his eye. A video involving Inko Midoriya, the mother of Izuku, the boy Tashinori had spoken about with such pride. Out of curiosity and the faint tug of concern, he clicked on it. The video began with the shaky image of Inko, her eyes red and hollow, her face pale, as if all hope had drained from her. She looked exhausted and broken in a way he had never seen, even though he had once met her as a cheerful young mother. Her voice, however, was what truly shook him. It was raw, vulnerable, and filled with bitterness. "I am Inko Midoriya," she began, clutching the bottle of wine as if it were her only support. "Some of you may know me as the traitor's mother. But today, I have secrets I can't carry, any more secrets I refuse to take silently to my grave." Her hand trembled as she brushed away a stray tear, her breathing uneven. My real name is Inko 𝗬𝗵𝗲. Yes, my mother was Nana 𝗬𝗵𝗲, the former symbol of peace. I was her daughter, one of her 2 children. The words hit Gran Torino like a freight train. He couldn't move, his mind flashing back to memories of Nana. The proud, resilient, heroic woman he had fought beside. She had a daughter he hadn't known, and that daughter was now revealing a terrible truth. I am also the sister of Kotaro 𝗬𝗵𝗲, Inko continued, her tone growing more resentful, and I inherited her quirk even if I never wanted to use it. My father was killed in the line of duty, and while my mother fought her war for justice, she abandoned me and my brother in an orphanage. My brother, he hated her, he died hating her. And part of me hates her too. The bitterness in Inko's words echoed through Gran Torino's heart. He had known Nana's choices were difficult, but he never knew the impact on her children. As he listened, he felt the weight of Nana's legacy grow heavier. Then, Inko took a shaky breath and began speaking about her husband, Hisashi. I loved him so much, she confessed, her voice trembling with the memory. I thought he was just a kind, humble man. But later, after we married, he told me the truth. He was all for one. The same man that All Might, that Tashinori, despised. And he did it for us, to protect us from a world that would judge and scorn our son if they knew he was the child of both a hero's bloodline and a villain's. Gran Torino's heart twisted painfully as she poured out her soul. The revelation shook him. This boy he had once met was both All for One's son and Nana's grandson. And now, Tashinori and the Hero Society had thrown him into prison. Inko's voice grew weaker, tears streaming down her face as she spoke about her son, about how he had been sentenced for things she didn't believe he'd done. Her body shook as she took another sip from the bottle, barely able to hold back her sobs. To all of you heroes out there, I hate you, she said in a broken voice. You're responsible for all of this. You've taken everything from me, from my family. Because of your judgment, my husband has been taken, my son has been destroyed, and I can't go on any longer. Her final words cut through Gran Torino's chest like a dagger. To my son, if you're listening, destroy this rotten society that thinks it can tear our lives apart. Then, with a shuddering breath, she set the camera down, her sobs echoing before the screen faded to black. Gran Torino was left in silence, stunned, staring at the screen. The pain in his heart quickly ignited into anger. Tashinori's name appeared among those in interviews, alongside others from 𝗬𝗏. His fists clenched, the betrayal searing through him. He had trained Tashinori to uphold justice, to honor Nana's legacy. But Tashinori had allowed her grandson to be branded a traitor and tortured in a prison cell. Gran Torino stood up abruptly, grabbing his coat. His face was set in determination, and his mind was clear. Tashinori had betrayed Nana's family, and Gran Torino wasn't going to let him off easy. Gran Torino read the final update in utter disbelief, his trembling hands clutching the newspaper as the horrific truth sank in. Inko 𝗬𝗵𝗲, Nana's only daughter, had taken her own life. And her son, Nana's grandson, Izuku, was languishing in a prison cell, falsely accused and branded as a traitor by the very society his grandmother had once fought so hard to protect. Gran Torino's eyes burned with fury, his jaw clenched so tightly that it ached. The betrayal weighed heavily on his heart, and he felt an anger he hadn't felt in years. How could Tashinori, the one he had trained and trusted, allow things to spiral into such tragedy? Without a second thought, Gran Torino threw on his coat and stormed out of his house, his mind set on one thing: putting some sense, and a dose of reality, into his former student. Within minutes, he arrived at Tashinori's door and pounded on it, the sheer force rattling the frame. Tashinori opened it, his usual confident posture fading as he saw the stormy expression on his mentor's face. Before Tashinori could even speak, Gran Torino's hand shot out, grabbing him by the collar. He pulled Tashinori close, his voice a low, seething growl. Do you have any idea what you've done? The path you chose has left a family in ruins, a family that your mentor, Nana, fought her entire life to protect. You've betrayed everything she stood for, Tashinori. Tashinori tried to stammer a response, but Gran Torino cut him off with a bitter scoff. You threw Nana's grandson into prison, believing the lies instead of searching for the truth. You let an innocent boy be condemned without a second thought, and for what? To uphold this corrupted society. Gran Torino's fist clenched, and he couldn't restrain himself any longer. His fist connected with Tashinori's jaw, sending him stumbling back in shock. You let this society turn Nana's family into scapegoats. You betrayed her memory, her bloodline, and now her daughter is dead, Tashinori. Inko is gone because of your so-called justice. The words hit Tashinori harder than the punch. His face twisted with guilt and realization, as if the truth had finally struck him. His voice was weak as he whispered, I didn't know. I thought I was doing the right thing. Gran Torino stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. The right thing? You let an innocent boy rot in prison, allowed his mother to be humiliated and broken by a world that cared more about appearances than truth. You've created a monster out of Izuku, a monster that could have been avoided if you had simply looked beyond the surface. Tashinori lowered his head, his hands trembling as Gran Torino's words sank deep. He could feel the crushing weight of his mentor's disappointment, the sheer betrayal of Nana's memory bearing down on him. Gran Torino took a step back, his voice filled with disgust. Fix this, Tashinori. Before it's too late. The only thing holding that boy back was his mother's kindness. With her gone, he has nothing left to stop him from becoming the very thing you fear. Remember this, you planted the seeds of vengeance in Nana's grandson, and if he rises against you, that BLD will be on your hands. Turning his back, Gran Torino left Tashinori standing there in silence, the crushing reality of his actions finally settling in. Izuku sat chained to the chair, his head bowed, his body bruised and beaten from the relentless torment he endured daily in Tartarus. His wrists and ankles throbbed where the shackles dug into his skin. He tried to numb himself, to block out the world, to ignore the taunts and sneers of the guards around him, who took sick pleasure in breaking the spirit of the once aspiring hero. One guard sneered as he entered the room, holding up a small screen. Guess what we have here, Midoriya? He taunted. A little farewell message from Mommy dearest. Izuku's head snapped up, his green eyes wide with both fear and confusion. The guard shoved the screen in front of his face, pressing play. The video started, and there was his mother, tired, broken, tears escaping her cheeks as she stared into the camera, her voice filled with grief and anger as she spoke of the betrayal and agony inflicted upon their family. Izuku, my sweet boy, her words trembled, and Izuku's heart shattered as he watched her pain and sorrow spill out. Each word felt like a knife, slicing through him as she confessed her despair, her hatred for society, and the twisted reality that had brought their family to ruin. He could barely breathe as she continued, her voice tinged with a dark resolve he'd never seen in her before. You deserve better, and her voice broke, her expression filled with a chilling sadness. Destroy them, Izuku, destroy this society that thinks it can toy with lives and discard people when they're no longer useful. Avenge what they've done to us. No, Mom, don't, Izuku's voice cracked, his eyes filling with tears as he shook his head, desperately wanting to reach through the screen and pull her back from this brink. The guard smirked, his tone mocking. She didn't just record it, kid. It's been broadcasted all over Japan. Looks like your mom really wanted to give the world something to talk about. Izuku was shaking, disbelief mingling with a growing dread. No, please, this can't. And then the guard's mocking voice delivered the final blow. Oh, and in case you were wondering, your mother's well, she's gone, Midoriya. Took her own life right after recording this little message. Seems even she couldn't bear to be associated with the traitor she raised. Izuku's world crumbled. His heart felt like it had been ripped from his chest as his mother's last words, her final plea for revenge, echoed in his mind. His body felt numb, but within him, something was shifting, a darkness taking root where hope once resided. Your fault, kid, the guard continued, his words dripping with malice. Everyone's calling her the traitor's mother now. Imagine how ashamed she must have been. Izuku's fists clenched, his knuckles turning white, his nails digging into his palms as the rage within him grew. His sorrow and despair twisted, morphing into a relentless fury. All his dreams, all his ideals, had been shattered, and now he had nothing left to lose. For the first time, he felt the embers of vengeance stir in his heart. Meanwhile, All-Might watched the video in stunned silence, his face pale as he processed what he'd just seen and heard. Midoriya's confession and her connection to his former foe was already a devastating revelation, but it was the final words that shook him to his core. Nana had a daughter, he whispered, disbelief flooding his expression as his mind raced. All this time, he'd thought he'd known his mentor's legacy, believed he'd carried on her will without a trace of family to speak of. And now, he realized there was a whole hidden story, a child his mentor had left behind, a son she'd never even known about. Not only that, but Inko's husband had been all for one. The realization struck him like a hammer, the sheer weight of it almost too much to bear. All for one in Nana's daughter, he muttered, his thoughts spiraling. The enemy he'd spent years fighting, the embodiment of his greatest battles, had somehow entwined himself with his mentor's family, leaving a child who had once idolized heroes, who had fought to become one himself, now condemned and twisted by the system All Might once believed in. Horror crept over him as he watched Izuku's reaction on screen, the pain, the betrayal, and, finally, the flicker of something dark, something cold taking root in the young boy's eyes. This was no longer the same bright-eyed, hopeful student he'd met at U. This was a boy with nothing left, broken and hollowed by his own world. What have we done? All Might's voice trembled, the weight of his own responsibility crashing down on him. He'd believed in Izuku, chosen him as a successor, and now that very trust, his decision to remain silent and distant, felt like a mistake he couldn't undo. He saw the sorrowful, defeated image of the boy he'd once promised to protect, a boy who, against all odds, had always believed in him, only to be discarded. The screen went blank, and the silence that followed felt deafening. All Might's hands shook slightly as he clenched them, filled with an indescribable grief and guilt. He could almost feel Nana's spirit beside him, a questioning, heart-wrenching presence. He'd failed her legacy, and worst of all, failed the boy who'd tried so desperately to follow in his footsteps. "We created this," he murmured, his gaze falling to the floor as he wondered if there was any path left to right these wrongs, if Izuku would even want redemption. Or had the cruelty he'd endured already sealed his heart in darkness? In Tartarus, in the depths of Tartarus, All for One sat in his cell, an aura of power muted by the quirk-suppressing restraints that held him. He was accustomed to silence, accustomed to waiting, but the voice that had filled his cell just moments before was one he could never have prepared for. The video of Inko's confession played in his mind over and over, each word a knife twisting in his heart. He could see her as she was then, his beloved wife, her tears staining her cheeks as she recounted the life they'd shared and the fate that had been dealt to their son. Her anguish, her hatred for the heroes and the society that had shattered their family, and her final plea, a desperate call to end it all, left him numb, and yet, beneath that numbness, a storm of rage began to rise. His fingers clenched into fists as he replayed her words, her broken voice as she confessed their secrets to the world. He'd always known her strength, her loyalty, and her fierce love for Izuku. Yet to see her pushed so far, forced to carry the burden of shame and heartbreak alone, it was too much. His restraint wavered as fury simmered, the containment cuffs crackling with the effort to keep his power in check. "Izuku Inko," he whispered hoarsely, his voice laced with grief that he had long thought himself beyond. For all his ambitions, all the power he wielded, he'd failed to protect them, the two people who mattered most in his life. His enemies, the so-called heroes, had ripped his family apart, had branded his son a traitor, and had driven his wife to despair and death. And he could do nothing. Here, in this cold, silent cell, he was powerless, forced to watch from afar as the world took everything from him. Anger boiled within him, a dark, seething rage that threatened to burst through every barrier around him. The heroes had dared to condemn his son, to torture him in Tartarus, to turn his gentle-hearted, bright-eyed boy into a vessel of hate and vengeance. They would pay for it. Every one of them, from the leaders who wielded their power carelessly to the students who turned against Izuku. "You'll regret this, all of you," he muttered, his voice low and filled with a promise of retribution. The guards outside his cell cast wary glances at one another, sensing a shift in the air. The faint hum of his containment devices flickered. All for One's hands flexed, his mind already calculating, his years of planning and patience fusing with an entirely new motivation. He would escape one way or another. And when he did, he would not rest until justice, his justice, had been served. The memory of Inko's last words lingered, her final request echoing in his mind, "Destroy everything for me. Destroy this society." He would honor her plea, tear down the society that had broken her spirit and taken their son. The heroes, and everything they held dear would crumble beneath him. For his wife, for his son, he would make them pay. That night in the dimly lit cell, Izuku sat motionless, his bruised and battered form a testament to the relentless torment he had endured. But tonight, something in him had finally snapped. The rage and despair within him had simmered and boiled until they transformed into a cold, focused resolve. Every injury, every scar, every fractured bone had been forged into strength, hardening him physically and mentally. Slowly, he rose to his feet, shackles straining against his renewed force. With a single, powerful flex, the chains shattered, metal fragments clinking to the floor. His once kind, determined eyes were now vacant and hollow, devoid of hope or compassion. He looked around at his cellmates, who'd taken sadistic pleasure in his suffering, and they saw something in him that froze them in place, an unyielding fury that chilled to the bone. Without hesitation, Izuku moved through them like a storm, every punch, every strike landing with unrestrained power. They screamed as he broke their bones, delivering injuries they'd never forget, tearing through them with ruthless precision. He held nothing back, his movements relentless and efficient. As he stood amidst the broken bodies, his expression remained disturbingly blank, his gaze fixed on some distant point. His mind held only one thought, a vow of vengeance. The boy who had once dreamt of saving others was gone. Now only a hollow shell remained, a being forged from hatred and betrayal, seeking to unleash a reckoning on those who had stripped him of everything. Izuku lay down on the cold, hard floor of his cell, trying to find a semblance of peace amidst the rage that still simmered within him. But his attempt to rest was cut short when a group of guards stormed into his cell, sneering and taunting him. This time, however, they found no fear in his eyes, only an unyielding, empty darkness. Without warning, Izuku sprang to his feet, his movements swift and lethal. The guards' smirks faded, replaced with panic as he grabbed one by the arm, twisting until a sickening snap echoed through the cell. One by one, they tried to subdue him, but he met each attempt with terrifying ferocity. Limbs were wrenched and torn, bones shattered beneath his hands as he moved like a vengeful spirit, his expression cold and merciless. Shouts and screams filled the corridor as the guards outside saw the brutal scene unfolding, only to be drawn in themselves. They rushed to restrain him, but Izuku was unstoppable. He fought with the strength and fury of an Oni, each blow leaving lasting, unforgiving damage. The once quiet prison hallways now echoed with chaos, the guards lying broken and defeated in his wake. As the dust settled, Izuku stood alone, his cell littered with the shattered remains of those who had dared to break him. His breathing slowed and he returned to the cold floor, his hollow gaze drifting upwards. They had tried to reduce him to nothing, but he would be the one to destroy everything they held dear. Next morning the atmosphere in Tartarus grew colder as All Might entered the cell block where All for One was contained. The two men locked eyes, and despite his restraints, All for One's presence was chilling, an aura of pure malice contained only by the quirk-suppressing cuffs that bound him. For the first time in his life, All Might felt something akin to hesitation as he looked into the face of his old enemy, a man of his power but consumed with rage. As All Might approached, All for One's gaze narrowed, his voice dripping with venom as he spoke. If it weren't for these demon cuffs, Tashinori and every so-called hero out there would be dead by now. His words were low, a quiet promise laced with a hatred that made the air seem heavier. How dare you all? Do you realize what you've done? Because of your selfish actions, your blindness, my wife is dead. Do you even understand the consequences of what you've taken from me? His tone rose, every word a razor aimed at All Might's conscience. All Might stood his ground but struggled to maintain his composure. "I didn't know," he began, but All for One cut him off with a bitter, humorless laugh. "Didn't know?" All for One's eyes were cold, yet they burned with fury. "You heroes, you think you're noble, you think you're righteous, but in your arrogance, you've destroyed the lives of the very people you claim to protect. You paraded my son as a traitor and drove my wife to despair." His voice shook, echoing off the walls, filled with raw, unfiltered grief and anger. "What happened to her, Tashinori? Tell me everything. I want to know what led to her final moments." All Might's own emotions warred within him, guilt mixing with anger as he struggled to find the words. "Inko she," he stammered, feeling the weight of his own role in the events that had unfolded. "She revealed everything, your relationship, her past, and in her pain he trailed off, not wanting to say it outright, but knowing there was no avoiding it. She suffered until there was nothing left," All for One said, his voice bitter, realizing the truth as it settled heavily upon him. "And you all celebrated." His voice dropped to a deadly whisper. "You heroes had a party, didn't you? While my son suffered, while my wife was left to rot in despair, you were celebrating." All Might's jaw clenched, feeling the weight of All for One's words. "It wasn't, save your excuses," All for One spat, eyes blazing with hatred. "If my son becomes the monster you all feared, know that it's on you. Every single one of you. This society you uphold, this false peace it's built on the broken lives of people you don't care about." He leaned forward, his restrained hands trembling with barely contained rage. "When I break out of here, All Might, I will not rest until I've destroyed every piece of it, in her name." All Might felt a shiver run down his spine, knowing that, despite his defeated state, All for One's resolve had only grown more dangerous. All for One's eyes glinted with a cold, calculating fury as he leaned closer, his restrained hands trembling with barely concealed rage. "You planted the seed of vengeance in my son, All Might. You and your precious heroes. Izuku might have had a chance, but now, you've pushed him too far. What was holding him back was his mother's kindness, her gentle heart, but after seeing what's been done to her, he won't stay silent anymore." All Might could only listen, feeling the weight of those words pressed down on him like stones. He struggled to find a response, but before he could, All for One continued, his voice filled with a dark certainty. "You and your damned society have driven him over the edge," he hissed. "Remember this, Tashinori, he is my son. The blood of destruction flows through him. He could become everything you feared I would be, a symbol of pure evil and devastation, a force that will tear down every one of your so-called pillars of peace. He will take my place. And do you know his quirk, Tashinori?" All Might was silent, his face grim. "He is an elementalist, able to command every element to his will. I blocked it when he was young, weakened it to keep him safe because his body couldn't handle its power. But tomorrow," All for One's gaze grew more intense, "tomorrow is his birthday, the day he reaches the age where his full potential will awaken. And when he does, I'll be waiting, ready to pass on my power to him." All Might's fists clenched, the reality of what All for One was saying settling heavily in his mind. "Tell your 𝗵𝗃 All Might," All for One sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Tell her she has failed yet another grandchild. First, Tenko, now Izuku. Her daughter, her son, and now her grandson, all turned away from her so-called heroism, lost to her noble ideals. They both despised her, Inko and Izuku alike. They hated what she stood for, the way she abandoned family for society's expectations. They are lost because of her, and you." He paused, the hatred in his eyes simmering. "Izuku will destroy you, and he will shatter everything you hold dear. This is a promise, All Might, a promise from a father and a husband who will see vengeance delivered, no matter the cost." All Might felt a coldness settle within him, realizing that the man before him wasn't just a villain. He was a father, vowing to leave behind a legacy of hatred that would consume the very heart of the hero world. Inside One for All, inside the realm of One for All, the vestiges of the past wielders stood in stunned silence, watching the chilling scene before them. They could hardly believe what they were seeing, the heartbreaking video of Inko 𝗬𝗵𝗲, a woman they had known only in fragments, now pouring her heart out in raw agony. The air was heavy as her voice filled the space, her words striking each of them with a relentless force. Nana 𝗬𝗵𝗲 watched in horror as her daughter's image played on the screen, her once vibrant and hopeful child now a shadow, a woman broken by years of loneliness, betrayal, and grief. Nana's hands trembled as Inko recounted her abandonment, the scars left by her mother's choice to leave her and 𝗬𝗪𝗏 behind. Each word was a knife, a painful reminder of the sacrifices Nana had made, choices she had believed were right for the greater good, but now realized had left a deep, irrevocable wound. As Inko revealed the truth about 𝗧𝗵𝗃, Nana's heart sank further. She had never known that her own grandson, Izuku, bore the legacy of 𝗳𝗏𝗃. The weight of her decisions, the generations of suffering they had caused, crashed down on her with unbearable clarity. All Might, too, watched in silent devastation. He had always carried the weight of his mentor's legacy with pride, but now he felt only guilt, seeing the consequences that had rippled through Nana's family. As Inko's final words echoed, "Destroy them, Izuku, destroy this society that thinks it can toy with lives and discard people when they're no longer useful." The spirits of One for All were left reeling. This was a woman who had lost everything to a world that glorified heroes, only to abandon those it had deemed unworthy of salvation. Inko's plea hung heavy in the air, a haunting curse that resonated deep within each of them. Nana collapsed to her knees, her face buried in her hands as she wept, the full weight of her actions finally breaking her. She whispered, "Inko, my dear, sweet Inko, I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this." Her regret echoed, reaching the ears of each One for All user, a reminder that heroism often came at a price, one they had always thought worth paying until now. Yagi, his face filled with grief, rested a hand on Nana's shoulder. I never imagined this would be the cost of our mission," he murmured, his voice choked with sorrow. The others were silent, each lost in thought, burdened by the realization of what their legacy had done to the family they had sworn to protect. Inko's final image faded, her message lingering in their minds, a testament to the brokenness that lay beneath society's expectations, a challenge to the ideals they had fought so long to uphold. They could no longer ignore the pain their choices had caused, nor the cost that had been paid by those left behind. The spirit of One for All was left with a scar, a reminder that heroism, for all its glory, had a darker side, one that could destroy lives just as easily as it saved them. Nana's spirit shattered further upon hearing Inko's last, tragic decision. The weight of her daughter's final act hit her like a tidal wave, sinking her into a pit of grief and despair. Her body shook, her cries echoing through the empty, timeless space of One for All, and every past user watched, unable to offer solace for the pain she bore. Each revelation had already torn through Nana: the abandonment of her children, the path 𝗬𝗪𝗏 had taken, the suffering her grandson had endured. But Inko's final act of desperation was a pain beyond anything she could bear. Her mind replayed the image of her daughter in that dark, lonely room, the hopelessness in her eyes as she recorded her last words. It was a heartbreak she would never recover from, a wound carved so deep that it reverberated through the very core of One for All. Why did it have to be like this? Nana choked out, voice quivering, her hands gripping her chest as if trying to stop her heart from breaking completely. All Might placed a hand on her shoulder, but no words could comfort her, no heroism could erase the reality that her choices had left a legacy of pain, grief, and brokenness for her family. As Nana sat in her despair, the other users shared her guilt, feeling the weight of the tragic history they had all contributed to. In the silent space of One for All, they stood together, mourning not just Inko, but all the lives and dreams lost to the ideals they had fought so tirelessly to uphold. As show All Might out of his mindskbez, he left as he didn't say anything, as all for one last warning come from behind, and it was a warning for him. My son will take his revenge. All Might remember words. He will destroy the society and all the heroes till he doesn't fulfill Inko last wish. Remember it. All Might, he will come for you all for one said, laughing maniacally. As All Might has one thing, did they really do the right thing, or that they really created a monster that will destroy the society till he doesn't feel satisfied with his work? Meanwhile, in cafeteria, the next day in the cafeteria, an unsettling silence blanketed the air as Izuku entered. His figure cast an imposing shadow, his expression hardened, and his eyes void of any remaining trace of innocence or fear. The other inmates, sensing something different, whispered amongst themselves, but a few dared to taunt him, sneering as they tried to provoke him once more. Izuku didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped forward, his eyes darkening as he focused on those who approached him with hostility. In a heartbeat, he struck, his movements precise and devastating. Every punch and kick landed with bone-crushing force, and soon, the cafeteria descended into chaos as inmates scrambled to defend themselves or retreat. Behind him, as if conjured by his fury, a haunting silhouette of a monstrous Oni seemed to loom, its sharp fangs and wild, demonic eyes amplifying the menace Izuku radiated. The sight chilled everyone to the core, and the bravest inmates who had once taken pride in tormenting him now trembled. One by one, Izuku tore through them, his expression never changing. The force of his strikes left them writhing on the floor, bones broken, their screams echoing throughout the prison walls. Some tried to crawl away, but Izuku showed no mercy, ensuring each one felt the weight of every blow he'd endured at their hands. The guards watched, paralyzed, as Izuku single-handedly dismantled the cafeteria. To them, he looked like a true Oni, his rage manifesting into something unstoppable and terrifying. This was no longer the boy they had ridiculed and beaten down. He was now a relentless force, hardened and shaped by the unforgiving treatment he'd suffered. And as the last of his aggressors lay broken before him, Izuku straightened, an emotionless, hollow gaze sweeping over the silent, fearful room. His mind was clear, and one thought remained: vengeance. Izuku strode to the counter, his presence alone making the cafeteria worker hesitate. The server, who had once delighted in withholding food or throwing scraps to mock him, now stared back, hands trembling. "Give me food," Izuku demanded, his voice low and cold. "Better than the scraps you hand out to these Vestiges." The server swallowed, glancing nervously at the guards who now averted their eyes, unwilling to intervene after witnessing the carnage Izuku had unleashed. With a shaky nod, the server quickly scooped a proper portion onto Izuku's tray, giving him the best he could offer without a second thought. Izuku didn't thank him. Without sparing another glance, he took his tray and found an empty table, the inmates around him silent, casting wary glances as he sat. No one dared approach or even whisper, the terror in the air palpable. For the first time, they realized that the boy they had mocked, the one they had tried to break, was now someone far beyond their reach, someone even they feared. Izuku finished his meal, then stood, letting his gaze sweep over the silent cafeteria. His voice cut through the tense air, calm but laced with a promise of violence. "I want a better bed. And better conditions in my cell," he said slowly, making sure every guard, inmate, and staff member heard. "If I don't get it, there will be consequences." As he made his way toward the gym, those nearby instinctively parted to let him pass. When he reached the training area, he turned back to the guards lingering by the door. "I'm here to train. Any of you idiots dare to interrupt me, you'll face the Oni you're all so afraid of." The guards shifted uncomfortably, sharing uneasy glances but staying rooted where they were, uncertain and wary. Izuku's reputation was spreading quickly, his presence now a shadow hanging over the prison, a vengeful force none dared to challenge. Izuku lifted the barbell, its weight effortless in his grip. He sensed the few prisoners creeping up behind him, whispering and snickering clearly, underestimating his resolve. In one swift motion, he swung the barbell backward, feeling it connect with a satisfying thud as the first inmate stumbled back, clutching his face in shock. The others quickly tried to back away, but Izuku's eyes narrowed, and he lunged forward, the barbell moving like an extension of his fury. One by one, each prisoner fell under his relentless strikes. BLD splattered as he landed blow after blow, his face emotionless and unyielding. Groans of pain filled the gym, and yet he continued, leaving no one standing. By the time he stopped, the once pristine barbell was dripping with BLD, his hands gripping it tightly as he stood over the broken bodies around him. The others in the gym could only watch, frozen, as Izuku let the barbell drop with a chilling clang. Without a word, he turned his back on the carnage and walked away, leaving behind the bruised and bleeding prisoners. His expression was calm, but his eyes held a dark, unspoken promise for anyone else foolish enough to test him. Gran Torino 𝗵𝗃. It was a quiet night in Gran Torino's modest, dimly lit home when he first noticed the notification of a viral video. He didn't often check the news, but something in the title caught his eye. A video involving Izuku Midoriya, the mother of Izuku, the boy Tashinori had spoken about with such pride. Out of curiosity and the faint tug of concern, he clicked on it. The video began with the shaky image of Inko, her eyes red and hollow, her face pale, as if all hope had drained from her. She looked exhausted and broken in a way he had never seen, even though he had once met her as a cheerful young mother. Her voice, however, was what truly shook him. It was raw, vulnerable, and filled with bitterness. "I am Izuku Midoriya," she began, clutching the bottle of wine as if it were her only support. "Some of you may know me as the traitor's mother. But today, I have secrets I can't carry, any more secrets I refuse to take silently to my grave." Her hand trembled as she brushed away a stray tear, her breathing uneven. "My real name is Inko 𝗧𝗵𝗲. Yes, my mother was 𝗧𝗵𝗲, the former symbol of peace. I was her daughter, one of her 2 children." The words hit Gran Torino like a freight train. He couldn't move, his mind flashing back to memories of Nana. The proud, resilient, heroic woman he had fought beside. She had a daughter he hadn't known, and that daughter was now revealing a terrible truth. "I am also the sister of Kotaro 𝗧𝗵𝗲," Inko continued, her tone growing more resentful, "and I inherited her quirk even if I never wanted to use it. My father was killed in the line of duty, and while my mother fought her war for justice, she abandoned me and my brother in an orphanage. My brother, he hated her, he died hating her. And part of me hates her too." The bitterness in Inko's words echoed through Gran Torino's heart. He had known Nana's choices were difficult, but he never knew the impact on her children. As he listened, he felt the weight of Nana's legacy grow heavier. Then, Inko took a shaky breath and began speaking about her husband, Hisashi. "I loved him so much," she confessed, her voice trembling with the memory. "I thought he was just a kind, humble man. But later, after we married, he told me the truth. He was all for one. The same man that All Might, that Tashinori, despised. And he did it for us, to protect us from a world that would judge and scorn our son if they knew he was the child of both a hero's bloodline and a villain's." Gran Torino's heart twisted painfully as she poured out her soul. The revelation shook him. This boy he had once met was both All for One's son and Nana's grandson. And now, Tashinori and the Hero Society had thrown him into prison. Inko's voice grew weaker, tears streaming down her face as she spoke about her son, about how he had been sentenced for things she didn't believe he'd done. Her body shook as she took another sip from the bottle, barely able to hold back her sobs. "To all of you heroes out there, I hate you," she said in a broken voice. "You're responsible for all of this. You've taken everything from me, from my family. Because of your judgment, my husband has been taken, my son has been destroyed, and I can't go on any longer." Her final words cut through Gran Torino's chest like a dagger. "To my son, if you're listening, destroy this rotten society that thinks it can tear our lives apart." Then, with a shuddering breath, she set the camera down, her sobs echoing before the screen faded to black. Gran Torino was left in silence, stunned, staring at the screen. The pain in his heart quickly ignited into anger. Tashinori's name appeared among those in interviews, alongside others from you. His fists clenched, the betrayal searing through him. He had trained Tashinori to uphold justice, to honor Nana's legacy. But Tashinori had allowed her grandson to be branded a traitor and tortured in a prison cell. Gran Torino stood up abruptly, grabbing his coat. His face was set in determination, and his mind was clear. Tashinori had betrayed Nana's family, and Gran Torino wasn't going to let him off easy. Gran Torino read the final update in utter disbelief, his trembling hands clutching the newspaper as the horrific truth sank in. Inko 𝗧𝗵𝗲, Nana's only daughter, had taken her own life. and her son, Nana's grandson, Izuku, was languishing in a prison cell, falsely accused and branded as a traitor by the very society his grandmother had once fought so hard to protect. Gran Torino's eyes burned with fury, his jaw clenched so tightly that it ached. The betrayal weighed heavily on his heart, and he felt an anger he hadn't felt in years. How could Tashinori, the one he had trained and trusted, allow things to spiral into such tragedy? Without a second thought, Gran Torino threw on his coat and stormed out of his house, his mind set on one thing: putting some sense, and a dose of reality, into his former student. Within minutes, he arrived at Tashinori's door and pounded on it, the sheer force rattling the frame. Tashinori opened it, his usual confident posture fading as he saw the stormy expression on his mentor's face. Before Tashinori could even speak, Gran Torino's hand shot out, grabbing him by the collar. He pulled Tashinori close, his voice a low, seething growl. "Fool, do you have any idea what you've done? The path you chose has left a family in ruins, a family that your mentor, Nana, fought her entire life to protect. You've betrayed everything she stood for, Tashinori." Tashinori tried to stammer a response, but Gran Torino cut him off with a bitter scoff. "You threw Nana's grandson into prison, believing the lies instead of searching for the truth. You let an innocent boy be condemned without a second thought, and for what? To uphold this corrupted society." Gran Torino's fist clenched, and he couldn't restrain himself any longer. His fist connected with Tashinori's jaw, sending him stumbling back in shock. "You let this society turn Nana's family into scapegoats. You betrayed her memory, her bloodline, and now her daughter is dead, Tashinori. Inko is gone because of your so-called justice." The words hit Tashinori harder than the punch. His face twisted with guilt and realization, as if the truth had finally struck him. His voice was weak as he whispered, I didn't know. I thought I was doing the right thing." Gran Torino stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "The right thing? You let an innocent boy rot in prison, allowed his mother to be humiliated and broken. By a world that cared more about appearances than truth. You've created a monster out of Izuku, a monster that could have been avoided if you had simply looked beyond the surface." Tashinori lowered his head, his hands trembling as Gran Torino's words sank deep. He could feel the crushing weight of his mentor's disappointment, the sheer betrayal of Nana's memory bearing down on him. Gran Torino took a step back, his voice filled with disgust. "Fix this, Tashinori, before it's too late. The only thing holding that boy back was his mother's kindness. With her gone, he has nothing left to stop him from becoming the very thing you fear. Remember this, you planted the seeds of vengeance in Nana's grandson, and if he rises against you, that BLD will be on your hands." Turning his back, Gran Torino left Tashinori standing there in silence, the crushing reality of his actions finally settling in. Inside the dark, cold confines of the prison, Midoriya sat atop a heap of battered inmates, a mountain of bruised bodies that lay as a testament to his newfound power and ruthless resolve. Inside the dark, cold confines of the prison, Midoriya sat atop a heap of battered inmates, a mountain of bruised bodies that lay as a testament to his newfound power and ruthless resolve. His expression was eerily calm, devoid of empathy, as he surveyed the broken bodies beneath him. His eyes had shifted to a haunting form, black sclera surrounding stark white pupils, an unsettling gaze that pierced through the dim light, filling the room with a chilling aura. The prison warden stood paralyzed at the entrance, his heart pounding as he took in the scene. His mind raced back to the stories he'd heard of Tora Oni, the infamous former leader of the Yamazaki clan, a figure so feared that his very name sent shivers down the spines of even the most hardened criminals. Midoriya's presence now radiated that same bone-chilling aura, the same relentless, overwhelming strength that Tora Oni was known for. Midoriya's cold gaze shifted to the warden, who involuntarily took a step back, feeling his breath hitch as the young man's eyes locked onto him. It was as if he were staring into the eyes of a demon, a wrathful Oni reborn. Midoriya tilted his head slightly, a faint, twisted smile appearing on his face as he held the warden's gaze. He said nothing, yet the silence spoke louder than any words could, a silent promise of vengeance, a warning that he was beyond the control of anyone or anything. "Bring me what I need," he said in a low, almost guttural voice, every word laced with a threat. "Or else there will be hell to pay." The warden swallowed hard, his mind spinning as he remembered the tales of Tora Oni's unyielding rage and merciless nature. Now, standing before Midoriya, he felt the same aura, the same suffocating dread, a manifestation of pure wrath, ready to tear down everything in its path. Midoriya's voice cut through the silence, sharp and dripping with venom. He fixed the warden with a glare so intense it seemed to freeze the very air around him. "What are you, deaf or just plain stupid he spat, his tone leaving no room for defiance. "Do you want me to tear off one of your limbs so you can finally understand?" The warden felt a chill shoot down his spine as Midoriya's eyes glinted with a dark promise. The sheer force of his presence was overwhelming, and in that moment, the warden knew he was dealing with someone far beyond the broken young man they had sentenced to this hell. This was someone transformed, hardened, ruthless, and utterly unafraid. In a desperate attempt to keep his composure, the warden took a shaky breath, but his trembling hands betrayed him. Midoriya's patience had worn thin, and as he took a menacing step forward, the warden stumbled back, the realization dawning on him. This young man wasn't simply another prisoner to be subdued. He was a force of vengeance, ready to rip through anyone in his path. "Now," Midoriya continued, voice steady but laced with deadly intent, "bring me what I need. Unless you'd rather be the next broken body lying beneath my feet." Midoriya's gaze bore into the warden with an unyielding intensity, his tone now calm but menacing. "And one more thing," he added, lifting his restrained wrists slightly. "Remove these cuffs. 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏." The warden hesitated, beads of sweat forming on his brow as he weighed his options. Every instinct screamed at him to obey, to avoid becoming another casualty under Midoriya's terrifying resolve. But protocol and fear clashed in his mind, leaving him frozen. Midoriya's patience waned as he noticed the warden's hesitation. His expression darkened, his voice dropping into a cold, threatening whisper. "Unless you'd like a demonstration of what happens when I get uncomfortable." The warden gulped, his fear overwhelming any sense of protocol. With shaky hands, he pulled out the key, approaching Midoriya with a reluctance born of terror. He couldn't shake the feeling that removing those cuffs would unleash a storm far beyond anything the prison had ever contained. As the cuffs fell to the ground with a heavy clink, Midoriya twisted his body slightly and approached the warden. His eyes remained cold, dark, and emotionless. The warden, trembling with fear, took a step back, but Midoriya was faster. With a sudden, brutal movement, he grabbed the warden's arm and twisted it in an unnatural direction. A sickening crack echoed through the room as the warden cried out in pain, his face contorted in agony. Midoriya's expression remained unchanged, as though this was nothing more than a passing inconvenience. "You're lucky I don't feel like doing worse," Midoriya spoke, his voice chilling and detached. "Now, remove my cuffs and get me my things, before I decide to tear apart more than just your arm." The warden, gasping for breath and trying to regain his composure, shakily nodded, doing his best to remain calm as he fumbled with the cuffs. The pain from his dislocated arm was excruciating, but the terror of what Midoriya was capable of made him work faster. The fear in his eyes was unmistakable as he complied with Midoriya's command. Midoriya watched with amusement as the warden scrambled to do his bidding, fully aware of the power he now wielded. "Good," Midoriya said coldly. "Now, get to work." Midoriya made his way through the dim corridors of the prison until he reached the isolated cell where Stain, the infamous hero killer, was held. The room was silent, save for the sound of chains clinking as Stain sat in a meditative pose, his sharp eyes flickering open as he sensed Midoriya's approach. Without preamble, Midoriya spoke, his voice cold and steady. "Teach me the way of the assassin. I know who you are, an S-rank assassin, the very best at what you do." Stain's eyes narrowed as he studied Midoriya, intrigued but cautious. "Why would you want to learn that path?" he asked, his tone filled with suspicion and a hint of amusement. "A path that requires true conviction, a willingness to cast aside what's left of your old self." Midoriya's gaze was intense, filled with a mix of darkness and determination. I've already lost everything. My mother, my freedom, my future. The world has taken everything from me, and now, it's my turn to take something back. I want to know how to make them pay, not as a hero, but as an avenger. Stain smirked, nodding slightly, seeing a kindred spirit in Midoriya's resolve. Very well, he replied, his voice low but filled with a dark promise. But remember, once you step onto this path, there's no turning back. The way of an assassin demands sacrifice. Are you ready to embrace that? Without hesitation, Midoriya nodded. I am. Stain's smirk widened, approval glinting in his eyes. Then let the training begin. The dimly lit cell in Tartarus was oppressive, a cage for the most dangerous beings alive. The silence was broken only by the sound of chains clinking as Stain moved, his scarred face twisted into an amused smirk. Across from him, Izuku Midoriya stood like a statue. His emerald eyes were devoid of emotion, his posture unnervingly calm for someone in such an unforgiving place. Stain's voice broke the silence, low and gravelly, filled with a mix of intrigue and menace. You've got guts, Midoriya, he began, pacing in front of the boy. But guts alone won't save you. Out there, he gestured to the unseen world beyond the cell. Heroes, villains, monsters, they all want the same thing. Power. Control. They'll rip you apart without a second thought if you're weak. You want to destroy them. You want to survive. You need more than brute strength. You need to become a killer. And not just any killer. A predator who can use anything, everything as a weapon. Izuku didn't respond. His silence wasn't one of fear or hesitation but a cold, calculating patience. Stain's smirk widened. No whining. You're ready for the method. He crouched and scratched a rough circle onto the concrete floor with a broken shard of metal. Do you know what the Killer Peter SS rank method is? Izuku's eyes flicked to the circle and then back to Stain. It's the art of absolute efficiency, Stain explained, his voice taking on an almost reverent tone. Peter was a killer from an era long forgotten, a man who could turn anything, even a blade of grass, into a weapon. His philosophy was simple. A true killer doesn't rely on tools, they rely on intent and the environment. You will learn this. You will master it. And when you do, no one, not heroes, villains, or gods, will be able to stand against you. Lesson 1. The foundation of intent. Stain tossed a piece of chalk at Izuku's feet. The boy picked it up without hesitation, examining its brittle texture. Chalk, Stain said, his tone mocking. A child's toy. Useless, right? Wrong. In the hands of a killer, even this can end a life. The first step in the SS rank method is understanding that intent transforms the mundane into the deadly. Without warning, Stain lunged at Izuku, his chains clinking loudly as he closed the distance. Izuku instinctively stepped back, raising the chalk in a defensive gesture. Wrong. Stain barked, striking the chalk from his hand with a single motion. Never defend. Always attack. A killer doesn't react, they act. Izuku retrieved the chalk, his expression unchanging. He stood still for a moment, processing Stain's words. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, he lunged forward, aiming the chalk at Stain's throat. The hero killer sidestepped easily, his chains catching Izuku's arm and twisting it behind his back. Better, Stain muttered, releasing him. But you're still thinking like a hero. You hesitate. You aim to disable, not to kill. That hesitation will get you killed. Izuku rose to his feet, his emerald eyes glinting with a newfound understanding. He nodded silently. Lesson 2. The environment is your weapon. The next night, Stain expanded the lesson. He scattered various objects across the cell, rusty nails, shards of broken concrete, even a single shoelace. A killer doesn't carry an arsenal, Stain said. They are the arsenal. Everything around you is a weapon if you know how to use it. Izuku picked up the shoelace, his gaze thoughtful. This. Stain chuckled darkly. Good question. A shoelace can choke a man if used right. It can trip them, bind their limbs, or even act as a sling for a heavier object. The weapon isn't the shoelace, it's you. Izuku didn't reply, but his grip on the shoelace tightened. Over the next hour, 𝗧𝗵𝗲 demonstrated how to use each item in the room. He showed Izuku how to sharpen a nail against the concrete to create a makeshift dagger, how to use the weight of a shard to break bones, and how to turn a corner of the cell into a deadly trap. Adaptation is key, 𝗧𝗵𝗲 emphasized. The environment will always change. A true killer doesn't rely on familiarity. They see opportunity in chaos. Lesson 3. The Predator's Eye. By the third week, 𝗧𝗵𝗲 introduced the most critical part of the method, understanding the opponent. You've learned how to use your surroundings, 𝗧𝗵𝗲 said, pacing the cell. Now, you'll learn how to use your enemies against themselves. He crouched in front of Izuku, his scarred face inches away. A predator doesn't strike blindly. They observe, calculate, and then kill. The way they breathe, the way they stand, the way their eyes flicker, it all tells you how they'll move. Read them, Midoriya. See them before they see you. To test this, 𝗧𝗵𝗲 attacked without warning. Each strike was swift and brutal, but his movements carried subtle patterns, flickers of his gaze, shifts in his stance. Izuku was forced to rely not on instinct but on observation. Over time, he began to notice the signs, the slight tightening of 𝗧𝗵𝗲's muscles before a lunge, the faint twitch of his fingers before a feint. By the end of the lesson, Izuku had not only dodged several attacks but had countered one, grazing 𝗧𝗵𝗲's arm with a shard of concrete. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 grinned, blood dripping from the shallow wound. Now you're thinking like a predator. Next day in the dimly lit halls of Tartarus, Midoriya sat atop a crude throne of metal and chains, flanked by guards who seemed more nervous than protective. The echoes of footsteps reached him, and he turned his gaze toward the approaching figure. The guards stiffened as 𝗳𝗏 emerged, his ominous presence filling the room. There was a strange silence as he looked upon Midoriya, his eyes gleaming with a hidden intent. 𝗳𝗏's voice was smooth, almost cordial as he spoke. Well, the new king of Tartarus. Or should I say, Izuku Midoriya. Midoriya narrowed his eyes, reading between the lines. 𝗳𝗏 wasn't here just to acknowledge his strength or position in the prison. There was something else, a pull of familiarity in his voice, something beyond mere curiosity. Get to the point, Midoriya said coldly, not one to indulge in 𝗳𝗏's games. Why are you really here? A faint smile crossed 𝗳𝗏's lips, the type that never reached his eyes. Oh, I am here for a reason, Izuku. But perhaps not one you expect. Midoriya's gaze sharpened, his eyes narrowing. Stop speaking in riddles. 𝗳𝗏's composure didn't falter. He took a step closer, almost paternal in his demeanor, his voice lowered but steady. I wanted to see the young man you've become. After all, it's been some time since I last laid eyes on my own flesh and be. For a moment, the weight of his words seemed to hang in the air, cold and unforgiving. Midoriya's mind raced, and he felt his hands tighten at the sides of the throne, nails digging into the metal. His expression remained unreadable, but there was a dangerous intensity behind his eyes. You're lying, Midoriya replied flatly, though something within him was shaken. No, Izuku, 𝗳𝗏 replied, his voice surprisingly soft, almost regretful. Not this time. The truth was withheld to give you the life of a hero, away from me. But destiny brings us together. Midoriya's mind spun as he tried to reconcile this claim with everything he knew. If you think calling me, son, will get me on your side, you're a fool. 𝗳𝗏 chuckled, an eerie sound that sent shivers down the spines of those nearby. I never said I expected you to be swayed. But I wanted you to know. My legacy flows within you, even if you don't want to acknowledge it. Midoriya clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms, every instinct in him rejecting the idea. Your legacy means nothing to me. You're a monster. Whatever BLD you claim to share with me, it doesn't change who I am. 𝗳𝗏 nodded as though he'd anticipated the response. And yet, here you are, rising to power, commanding fear and respect. You are more like me than you realize. Midoriya's glare was icy, but there was no hesitation in his voice as he replied. I'll never become what you are. 𝗳𝗏's expression shifted, a strange mix of pride and amusement. We'll see, Izuku. We'll see if the path you walk remains your own, or if, in time, you find yourself drawn to mine. With that, he turned, his dark silhouette blending into the shadows, leaving Midoriya to process his words alone. As 𝗏𝗏's words faded into the darkness, he paused and looked back, his voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper. And Izuku, what about Inko? Are you planning to ignore her final wish? Midoriya's heart skipped a beat, his hands involuntarily gripping the armrests of his makeshift throne. The memory of his mother's face, her last words, cut through him like a blade. Destroy everything, Izuku, her voice echoed in his mind, filled with pain, bitterness, and desperation. 𝗏𝗏's tone softened, almost feigning sympathy. Her last wish so simple, yet so powerful. She wanted you to tear this world down, to make them all pay. He let the words hang, studying Midoriya's expression. Have you forgotten already? Midoriya's eyes darkened, his gaze falling to the ground as memories of his mother flooded his thoughts. The agony she endured, the world that turned its back on her, the quiet, seething anger she hid behind gentle smiles. Her last words weren't born of malice, but of grief, of feeling betrayed and helpless. That grief, that desperation, was now rooted deep in his own heart. What about her ashes? 𝗏𝗏 continued, pushing further, his voice a mixture of mockery and venom. Did they ever send them to you? Did those so-called heroes show any respect? Or did they just sweep it under the rug like everything else? Midoriya felt something snap within him. His jaw tightened, and he forced himself to breathe slowly, suppressing the surge of anger rising in his chest. His voice, when he finally spoke, was steady but simmering with rage. No, they didn't send anything. They discarded her like she meant nothing. 𝗏𝗏's smile twisted, pleased. Then you understand, don't you? The world she despised, the people who wronged her, they deserve nothing less than what she asked of you. Her wish is still waiting to be fulfilled. Midoriya's gaze hardened, an intense resolve settling within him. The weight of his mother's words, her last wish, was now etched into his heart as an oath. Destroy everything with one final glance, 𝗏𝗏 stepped back into the shadows, leaving Izuku alone with his thoughts and a choice: to honor his mother's final wish, no matter the cost. Izuku's eyes narrowed, his voice dripping with suspicion. Why did you call me here, old man? 𝗏𝗏 let a quiet chuckle escape, though his gaze remained deadly serious. I brought you here, Izuku, because I believe it's time you inherit my quirk, 𝗏𝗏. Midoriya stiffened. The very quirk that made this man a living nightmare, a legend of power and control. It was a gift with more darkness than he'd ever thought of wielding. But there's more, 𝗏𝗏 continued, his eyes gleaming as he held Midoriya's gaze. Your true quirk, the one you should have had from the beginning, Elementalist. I blocked it, knowing your young body was too fragile to handle its power back then. But now you're more than ready. The words hit Izuku like a shockwave. A quirk he'd never known he had, locked away this entire time. Elementalist, the very name radiated strength, the kind of power he'd always dreamed of having, of unleashing without constraint. 𝗏𝗏 watched as the realization dawned on him. You're angry, Izuku. You want to change this society, to tear down everything that wronged you and your mother. You can do it with 𝗏𝗏. But if you truly want to fulfill her last wish, you'll need more than rage. You'll need to wield both your elementalist abilities and my power. To destroy this rotten society, you'll have to do things differently. Izuku's gaze was intense, his mind racing. You blocked my real quirk all this time, and now you want me to inherit the very thing that gave you power. But what do you get out of this? 𝗏𝗏 leaned forward, his voice a dark murmur. Because the world has lost sight of true strength, Izuku. And because I see in you the will to reshape it, to lead it in a new direction. The world betrayed you, 𝗧𝗏 of everything. Isn't it time you made them remember what real power is? Izuku's expression hardened, the weight of his mother's final wish echoing in his mind. To honor her, to create change, maybe he did need to wield more than his own strength. Maybe he needed 𝗏𝗏's power to make this twisted society face justice. The path was brutal, but the promise of that power, it was almost impossible to resist. What do I have to do? he asked, his voice steady but charged with fierce resolve. All for one smiled, satisfied, seeing the spark of ambition and vengeance in his eyes. All for one continued, his voice surprisingly calm. If you're angry about the quirk blocking, know this. It wasn't just my decision. Your mother Inko was terrified for you. She knew my true identity, and she understood the weight of power, even if she hated me for it. She worried about what that quirk could do to you at such a young age. Izuku's eyes flickered, conflicting emotions surfacing. He could hardly imagine his mother having known any of this, much less trusting all for one enough to let him block his quirk. She was scared that power would consume you, that you'd hurt yourself in ways you couldn't understand. All for one's tone softened just a bit. Inko, she loved you more than anything. Enough that she was willing to let her son grow up without ever knowing his true power if it meant keeping you safe. Izuku clenched his fists, his anger somewhat tempered by the thought of his mother's worry. He could feel her fear and love through all for one's words, and it struck a nerve, leaving him with an unsettling mix of resentment and sadness. She'd been protecting him even in ways he'd never known. You had no right, he murmured, voice low but with a dangerous edge. Perhaps, all for one conceded, a slight nod as if acknowledging the pain he'd caused. But you have that power now, and her fears are no longer your burden to bear. You're ready to use it in a way she wouldn't have imagined for the change she would have wanted for you, and perhaps for more. Izuku's anger didn't fade entirely, but now it was focused, sharpened by understanding. His mother had tried to protect him, even if it meant aligning with someone she detested. All for one's words struck Izuku like a hammer, heavy and unrelenting. Understand this, Izuku, he continued, his tone sincere in a way that felt foreign, even unsettling. Your mother, she sacrificed her career, her ambitions, everything she'd worked so hard to build, just to raise you. She was brilliant. I saw her casework, her answer sheets, her court battles. She was a natural, one of the best. If she had wanted, she could have been one of the country's most revered judges or a renowned lawyer. He paused, letting that sink in. But she chose you. Every time. Izuku's mind flashed back to the framed degree in their modest apartment, to the way his mother sometimes looked at it, a small, wistful smile on her face. She'd never once complained, never once hinted at regret. She'd simply poured everything into raising him. She was exceptional, Izuku, all for one continued, his voice softer. And if there's a part of you that truly wants to honor her, to avenge the pain and injustice she suffered, then hear me out. His voice, always laced with manipulative charm, softened in a way Izuku had never heard before. Not as a villain. Not as the man the world calls a monster. But as your mother's husband, as the man who once held her trust. For her sake, give me a chance to guide you. Izuku's fists trembled, his heart a storm of emotions, rage, grief, and something harder to define. All for one had been everything he despised, everything his mother had once shielded him from. But now, as he stood there, looking into the eyes of the man who'd loved her in his own twisted way, he felt a pull, a deep, unyielding weight in his chest. Izuku's voice was low, almost a whisper. What would you have me do for her? All for one met his gaze, unwavering. Rise to the heights she dreamed of for you. Take the power to change this world, to root out the decay and bring forth a new order. This society is broken, Izuku, and you can be the one to rebuild it. For her. For everything she sacrificed. Izuku took a slow, deep breath, the weight of his mother's legacy settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about carrying on the strength, love, and fierce protection she'd shown him all his life. And if that meant listening to all for one, even just this once, then perhaps he owed her that much. Izuku's voice, cold and steely, cut through the silence like a blade. Give this world the pain they gave her, he murmured, his gaze hardening. 100 times worse than they gave to us. All for one's eyes gleamed with a dark satisfaction, sensing the unyielding resolve in Izuku. Exactly, he replied, a subtle smile on his lips. They took everything from her, from us. Now, it's time they understand what true suffering feels like. Izuku's fists clenched, a storm of emotion threatening to break free. They wanted me to be powerless. They thought they could silence her, cast her aside. I'll make them regret every second of that. All for One nodded approvingly, his voice soft but laced with venom. And they will. Through you, they'll know the consequences of underestimating her son. He took a step closer. Together, we'll dismantle this society that breeds hypocrisy and cruelty. Plus, Izuku's jaw tightened, the image of his mother's gentle smile flashing in his mind. She had sacrificed so much for him, sheltered him from darkness, even as it seeped into her own life. And now, he would return that devotion in the only way he knew how, by giving them all a taste of the fear, the helplessness, the agony that she had endured. For her, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. They'll pay. Every single one of them.